This is David Bergman, English editor at Netra News. Last month, I interviewed Brad Adams a few days after he left his post as the head of the Asia division of Human Rights Watch, a position he'd held for 20 years. I began by asking him about the direction of human rights in Bangladesh since he started work in the country in 2002. He began by talking about the Rapid Action Battalion, known as RAB, that was established by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party in 2004, and about conversations he'd had with Sheikh Hasina, who was head of the Awami League, in opposition at the time, who became Prime Minister in 2008, a position which he still holds.
What's very disappointing was that when the Awami League was in opposition, they were very loud opponents of RAB and other parts of the security services that were doing similar things. We met with Sheikh Hasina, we met with many officials in the Awami League, and they always said they were going to disband RAB and they were going to have complete control over the security services. And they claimed they were the party of human rights and democracy, freedom of expression. They said we are the liberal Democrats, and that we would restore the civil liberties and political rights to the country and make sure that there were no more extrajudicial killings or other kinds of state violence. Then, of course, came the military-backed caretaker government, where they tried to get rid of Hasina and Khaleda. And at various times they were both detained, and we were very loud, and in fact, some of the loudest international voices against it, because there were a lot of there's a lot of international support for the caretaker, because most diplomats and many governments didn't like either Khaleda or Hasina, and would have been very happy for both of them to disappear. They were hoping they would find a third way and get rid of these two parties that have very deep ties to corruption and very poor records of governance. But we warned the international community that wouldn't work. A, it was unprincipled. A military government is unprincipled. B, it's unprincipled to try to destroy political parties either from within or without. And C, we didn't think it would work because these parties have deep roots in the country and they weren't easily going to be disappeared. And in the end, it didn't work. The caretaker government didn't work. The attempt to bring in Yunus and other people as apolitical leaders didn't work. And the military realized it. When Hasina got out of detention, she personally, in my presence in London, thanked me, thanked Human Rights Watch, she said, whether it's true or not, that we had saved her life. She claimed that she was being poisoned in custody and that we were among the only voices that were calling for her release, and she did get released. We also were calling for the release of Khaleda and all sorts of other people that were being held by the authorities. As you may remember, DGFI was running basically torture centers, including one person who worked for us, Tasneem Khalil. And this was just routine and open and well known. And so our hopes were moderate because the human rights record of the Awami League and Hasina wasn't great in previous times in office. But we did think that possibly they had understood just how bad this was for the country, and that power had to that point alternated, and it would be good for them to keep their promise to, for instance, get rid of RAB and to have much greater control over the security services, because they would end up in opposition someday. And it hasn't worked out that way. We've seen since 2009 is that Hasina and the Awami League have grabbed full control of the state. And in their minds, the party and the state aren't very separate. And they think that they have an historical right to govern. And when a leader and a party think that they have the right to govern, not that they govern with consent of the public, but they have the right to govern, and that it's an existential fight with everybody else, then abuses happen routinely, and they can always be defended because we're doing this in the interests of the country, they would tell themselves, instead of in their own political interests. And so I think the trajectory right now is very negative. We haven't had serious multi-party elections for a long time. It's not clear that we're going to have them next time around either. And whether the Awami League would be willing, for example, to ensure a neutral election commission, the old caretaker system is already gone and won't be brought back, and to ensure that there's a level playing field for all parties is very unclear. So I think that people who work on this subject inside the country have been very clear to us that they're very pessimistic about the direction of travel on human rights and democracy, and external governments are also extremely pessimistic. I mean, Hasina is widely seen as an authoritarian leader who is surrounded by people who tell her what she wants to hear and who are desperate to remain in power themselves.
So you mentioned at the beginning of that you had a kind of a personal relationship with Sheikh Hasina. You met her at least once. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you found her, what kind of conversations you had, and whether you feel kind of personally let down?
I met her a few times. We didn't have a personal relationship. We were, as always, Human Rights Watch, fighting on principle. The principle was there shouldn't be arbitrary arrests, there should be political pluralism, there should be the rule of law, there should be multi-party politics, there should be free and fair elections. And she, at that point, after when the caretaker came in, was a victim, just like many other people were victims. I think that she and many people in her party misunderstood what we were doing, and maybe what other human rights groups were doing, as siding with them politically. We never were siding with them. We weren't against them. We weren't for them. Never have been, never will be. It's not our role. We're apolitical. But when sometimes, and I found this in many countries, when we call out a government, the opposition often thinks that we're aligning with them, or the government thinks that we're against them. And now we're in the situation where Hasina thinks we're against her and the Awami League simply because we've been documenting their human rights abuses and complaining loudly about them. So when I met her, she was very thankful. She was very gracious. She said that she had learned a lot of things in opposition and while in detention, and that she was really committed to cleaning up the security services, ensuring the rule of law and pluralism. I had colleagues who said, "Be careful, Brad. Let's see what she does." I was probably a little bit more optimistic than others, because when someone looks you in the eye and they've been a victim, you try to you want to believe them. So I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt for sure. When she came to London, and Lord Avebury, who had been a long-time supporter of human rights and democracy in Bangladesh, and a very important figure, he held kind of a celebration for her and honored her in a hearing or an event at the British Parliament. And he sat on the front dais, and he invited me to be on the dais, and I said, "No, I can't. I mean, I work for a human rights organization. We're non-political." And she and her supporters asked me to speak. So from the audience, I was asked to speak. And I think I disappointed her very much on that day, and that may have actually set the tone, because I stood up and said, "Look, I'm very pleased for you personally. You didn't belong in arbitrary detention. Nobody does. The country, you've just won an election, and I'm very hopeful that the Awami League will govern the country based on principles, human rights and democracy, and rule of law, etc. But I want you to remember that you made commitments when you were in the opposition, and you said you would get rid of RAB. You said that you would control the security services, and we're going to hold you to that." And I said very publicly, we do not support the Awami League as a party. That's not what we're here for. I'm very happy for all of you can have your celebration today, but we are an independent, impartial human rights group, and we'll hold you to account if you don't honor all your commitments, if you don't make sure there's freedom of expression, etc. We're gonna call it loud and clear, and we did. And very quickly, within a few months, we were publishing reports that we had been able to verify of significant human rights abuses. And so I met her one more time when she came to London a few months later, and she was extremely hostile to both me and Lord Avebury. We met her at a fancy hotel off of Hyde Park. And I'll just say, it's always distressing to me to see leaders of countries that are developing and recipients of significant international aid where there's massive poverty to be staying in 5-star hotels and renting out a whole floor of a hotel, which I've seen the Sri Lankan government do. I've seen, Bangladeshi authorities. I don't know if she had a whole floor, but she had a lot of space in a very fancy hotel. So like just this sort of sense of entitlement that people have when they get to power to spend £500 a night on a hotel room for a lot of officials is very distressing. Anyway, she was very rude to us. We brought up continued rap killings. We brought up problems of freedom of expression. We brought up the Chittagong Hill tracks. I remember all of those things. We brought up some issues related to women's rights and her commitments to that. And she really bristled. Like, I think she thought that we were just going to be there to say, congratulations, you're wonderful. You're a great prime minister. And we were saying, hey, no, we're expecting you to govern the country properly. And then of course, when she got into power, the BDR crisis happened. And I think it's for historians, and maybe you and other people know better, but there's some possibility that set her off track, that she had to rethink her own situation and make an alliance with the army and the security services that she may not have been wanting to do prior to that, because clearly her hold on power was at risk during and after the BDR crisis. So we'll never know what she might have done if the BDR crisis hadn't happened. I don't know whether that was all manufactured to destabilize her and the Awami League, or whether it just happened independently of that. In any case, she quickly formed a stronger alliance with all the security services, RAB, DGFI, Special Branch, the Border Guards. And I think she concluded that she needed to have them under her control even more quickly than she may have originally intended. And since then, we've seen the security forces operate with almost complete impunity, up to the point where they ended up, finally being sanctioned. RAB finally got sanctioned because of almost 2 decades of uninterrupted abuses with impunity.
So we'll come on to RAB in a minute, but apart from the BDR crisis, do you have any other explanations for why the human rights trajectory declined so significantly under the Awami League government? Do you have any other kind of explanations for that?
Well, I think there's a lot of people in the Awami League who are, around her. They should have quit when they saw that the leadership of the party wasn't committed to the ideals that they profess. But I think a lot of other people are in it just to make money and just to have titles and just to exert their power. And there's just so many thugs that are very high up in the Awami League. This was the story in their previous time in government. This was what was explained to me by people who knew Bangladesh very well before I got involved in working on Bangladesh from 2002 on. And they never really cleaned house. Those people are cancerous. They're cancerous in any party. And they do things in the name of the party and the leadership. And then many people in civil society who work for government and in the civil service, they're afraid to confront them because they don't know how strong their connections are to the leadership. If I challenge somebody, even if it seems like a mid-level person in the Awami League who does something bad, whether it's corruption or violence or some other misdeed, what's the risk? Am I going to lose my job or worse? How connected is this person? And the Awami League is full of people who act in the name of the party and even the leadership. And it's sometimes hard to know whether they actually do have that kind of support. So that's one thing that we saw very quickly. The second was that, Hasina definitely decided that she was not going to stop the security services. She was going to use them for her own purposes as a political tool. And it's hard to know whether that was always her intention or whether events led her there. And that's something that I can't judge, and other people have very strong opinions about. Many people think that was just how she always was, and have given me a hard time when I've said I wasn't sure. And there are other people who say no, these events, BDR and other things, led her down this path. But then the other thing that I think we can't overstate is her desire for vengeance through the International Crimes Tribunal, the ICT, and when you go on the path of setting up a tribunal to settle scores as opposed to have justice, it throws off all sorts of bad consequences. And in this case, the consequences were trials without evidence, convictions of people without evidence, hangings without evidence. And then she found that this actually commanded probably much greater public support than even she realized. And it made the whole effort almost untouchable. So we were saying, of course, we want these people to be held accountable, but they should be held accountable through fair trials. And frankly, this is better for you and the country in the long run, because if it's through fair trials and the evidence is clear, then people will accept it. If you have the kind of trials that we saw in many cases where there was, the person may have been guilty, but the evidence wasn't presented in court, you'll end up having people who think that they've been wronged historically. And when they get to power, they will try to seek their own form of vengeance, or what they might consider to be justice. And so it becomes a vicious circle. But that empowered her, the ICT empowered her, I think, in a way that kind of elevated her and allowed her, to cut corners on the rule of law and justice that spilled over and gave more space for the authorities to use RAB and to use DGFI and to use other elements of the security services to execute political opponents, B, to use them to threaten people so that they could take money or land or their businesses, or C, to settle petty local scores, but to have the name of the Awami League or the name of RAB or someone else behind them. As we know, RAB has been used both for counterterror, but also for corrupt purposes. They've been paid to carry out hits on people, and people in RAB have told us this. People in the Awami League have admitted this. I mean, Awami League, doesn't in private. They don't deny any of this. They just say, well, we're trying our best to clean it up, and we need RAB for legitimate reasons.
So the International Crimes Tribunal, I mean, that was an interesting time in Bangladesh, and Human Rights Watch did quite a lot of campaigning on that issue. That was obviously quite controversial in the context of Bangladesh, in the sense that the trials were very popular, and many people wanted these men just to be hung, found convicted and hung, and found the concerns that Human Rights Watch and others making about the tribunals to be just obstacles in the way of that. I mean, looking back on that, how do you feel about the way Human Rights Watch dealt with the tribunals?
Well, one thing is true is universally, which is that standing up for the rights of vulnerable individuals or communities is very often unpopular. I mean, my own country, the U.S., I mean, standing up for undocumented migrants, for example, or for people who have committed heinous violent acts, but where you're in principle against the death penalty, has often been very unpopular. And there's so many different kinds of causes like that. So that's not surprising, that there would be public opinion in support of bringing to justice people who many people in the public thought, we all know they're guilty. So let's who cares about the trial? Who cares about the facts? We know they're guilty. This is basically what Hasina was saying, and people around her. We know they're guilty. Well, we know they're guilty isn't good enough. What's important in any civilized country is to ensure that there's fairness in any legal process, particularly one where someone's life can be taken. And that's why the EU wouldn't support this. That's why Stephen Rapp, even though the United States uses the death penalty, personally kind of went beyond his remit, because the U.S. is not a good international spokesperson on the death penalty, because the U.S. has used it for so long and still does. But he basically said, look, in the U.S., we have death penalty after a fair trial, and we can debate whether that's always the case. I don't think so. But his line was, fair trial is the predicate. So I'm not going to oppose it on the grounds of the death penalty, but you have to have fair trials. And he looked at it very carefully, just like we did, and just as some other groups did. And we concluded, after looking at the evidence very carefully, interviewing judges, interviewing prosecutors, and finding that they were not conducting fair trials based on due process and evidence. I had meetings with the chief prosecutor that basically, frankly, boggled my mind. I mean, he was totally disinterested in fair trials. He was completely unable to explain their investigative process, how they collected facts, how they verified them, why they were using hearsay from 30 years ago from somebody who wasn't even present, describing an alleged murder scene as their main evidence in a trial. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Somebody who wasn't present 30 years ago or more saying that I am sure that this happened because somebody told me it happened, and that being the main basis for convicting someone. That's not a serious justice process. And so if I ever regret about this, it's that A, we were unable to reach people who would otherwise be reasonable people, I think. I mean, there are many people in the Bangladesh human rights community and the journalistic community who generally believe in fair trials and due process, who were very unhappy with us because they also wanted these people to be held accountable. And what I said to them was, we do too, if they're guilty. And we will never know if they're guilty unless evidence presented in a fair trial. So I'm disappointed that we couldn't persuade like-minded people even that this was important, with some exceptions. And B, I'm also, if I had any critique of our work, I wish we had done more of it. It is very time intensive. It takes a lot of time and effort to follow a trial. And at the beginning, we did that very carefully. And then there were so many trials, we couldn't keep up with it. And I hope somebody can do justice to this unjust process someday and really go back and look at all the trials and identify where was sufficient evidence presented to reach a guilty verdict and where wasn't there. And what does this tell the country? And what does this tell the international community? And I'll just end on this. I don't know of a single independent organization that looked at the ICT that thought these are credible trials. Many universities had projects working on this. Many donor countries wanted to be involved because they wanted to support accountability. I mean, look, Human Rights Watch, we support accountability for war crimes and grave human rights abuses around the world. It's one of the main things we do. Like, we're in favor of this, but it has to be through a proper process. And no independent organization I know of, truly independent organization, consider these to be fair trials.
Probably most of your work in Bangladesh, definitely in recent years, has been about extrajudicial killings and disappearances. A number of reports on that. What is your view about the work that you've done, and particularly in forced disappearances, which is although extrajudicial killings, as you mentioned earlier, definitely existed under other governments. It was RAB, it was BNP who introduced RAB, for example, as you mentioned. But in forced disappearances was a relatively new strategy or a violation that was introduced into Bangladesh when the Awami League came into power. So could you just kind of talk about extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances and your views on them in the context of Bangladesh?
Sure. I should just mention that RAB is the most famous, purveyor of extrajudicial killings, but they're not the only one. There are other security services that do it. And I also should mention, this was in one of our reports in the 2000s, like maybe in 2005 or 6 or 7. But a very senior BNP official admitted to me that he had been present at meetings with Kaleda when they started the Rapid Action Battalion, and that they had decided to use it to kill people. And this was an open admission. We've published this. And he said, I was in favor of this because we had a big problem with organized crime. And the only way we thought we could do it, because our courts didn't work, people would buy their way out. Very rich and powerful criminals would buy their way out of the courts, out of trials, was to go after them. But he said, I became concerned when it started being used for political reasons. And it was really striking to me that he thought that what he was telling me was something I would appreciate and agree with. As if the line, it's okay to kill criminals, but not to go after opposition politicians. And of course I said, no, this is unacceptable completely. So we know from the beginning that RAB was used in this way, and there's no reason to think that only RAB was used in this way. Yes, it was used to go after criminals, and some people may think that's okay, but it's not okay. No civilized society should operate that way. But from the beginning, from early on, it was also used to go after people who they were seen as political threats. Just wanted to put that on the record. when we talked to the BNP and the caretaker government and then the Awami League about extrajudicial killings, we told them, we predicted that someday it could metastasize into something different as well. Because that's the logic of countries that operate with security forces with impunity and use violence to achieve either political or corrupt ends. And we explained to them that in many countries where violence was used, this ended up turning into large-scale arbitrary detentions and often into large numbers of disappearances. And we pointed to Sri Lanka as an example, where there was a huge problem of disappearances. We pointed to Pakistan, where the ISI for years has played this game of disappearing people. We were assured, no, this would never happen. No, we have complete control over them, particularly after the second Awami League electoral success. When they won in 2014, when the BNP didn't participate, when they felt like they were in full control, very confident, like, we have control over this, Mr. Adams. This will not happen. And it has. People just disappear permanently. And obviously, until you find their body or have some other evidence that they were actually killed, it's hard to know whether they are just disappeared or whether they're dead. One of the reasons that there's this International Convention on Disappearances, which Human Rights Watch was part of creating, is because it is horrible for a family and friends and anybody who loves or cares about somebody to not know what happened to that person. And we've had many family members tell us, I obviously dare to dream that my husband, father, son, wife, mother, whatever, is still alive, but I really don't think that's true. And I'd rather know that they were dead than to live with this uncertainty. It's a terrible, terrible thing for people to have to face. And so this is a really wicked development in Bangladesh, and one we'd all hoped would not happen. But it has, and there are large numbers of them. They're very well documented. The government denies this. The evidence is undeniable. And it could be stopped. As with all of the things we're talking about, if Sheikh Hasina wanted to stop them, she could mostly stop them. There will be some rogue actors, but then she could deal with them through the justice system and hold them accountable. But she hasn't done that. And so these people are allowed to carry on doing what they're doing, and Hasina just pretends that it's not happening or turns a blind eye. I don't believe, by the way, the narrative that she's out of touch and doesn't know. Some people try to say, well, she's got other things on her mind. She's dealing with economics and other things. No, I mean, the political class in Bangladesh is pretty small, and the leadership, they know what's going on with these things.
So, I mean, as you well know, recently the United States government imposed sanctions on Rapid Action Battalion and on a number of current and former senior officials of RAB, including the current head of Bangladesh Police. I mean, how significant do you feel that decision is, on an international perspective, but also in the context specifically of Bangladesh?
I think it's very important because I've used the word impunity many times, and this is starting to chip away at an international level. I mean, ultimately, it will probably be up to the Bangladeshi government and authorities and courts and prosecutors to hold people accountable. But this is a very strong message that Bangladesh isn't special, that when there are death squads in the country, that the people who are behind them are known, identified. This sanction wasn't put in place without substantial evidence. I've worked on sanctions on many countries with many authorities, the US, the EU, the UK, France, Germany, Australia, lots of countries that have sanctions regimes. And they have a very high threshold, a very high standard of evidence that they require before they're sanctioning anyone. It's not something they do lightly or quickly. We're quite frustrated with how hard it is to get this to happen. I mean, you look at the Philippines, for example. Duterte's war on drugs has been disastrous. Probably tens of thousands of people have been killed. Nobody has a precise number. And the United States has moved so slowly, possibly for political reasons, because the U.S. has great interests in the South Pacific, South China Sea region, possibly for bureaucratic reasons. It's hard to know. But they should have sanctioned many more people in the Philippines in the last 6 years than they have. So it took a long time, and we were hardly the only ones urging this. Many groups were encouraging the U.S. and EU and others to sanction the leadership of RAB, and it finally happened. And I think it is, you look at, one way you judge this is by the reaction of people who are facing sanctions, whether it's the individuals or the governments concerned. And their reaction has been very strong. This has really hit them hard, and it should. And the goal here is, number one, deterrence, that this discourages business as usual for people who are engaged in this kind of activity. And we have seen a substantial decrease in the number of extrajudicial killings by RAB and probably other security forces since this was announced. The second goal is accountability, holding people personally accountable. That's harder because these kind of sanctions don't easily translate into prosecutions in third countries, because often the people who are sanctioned, stop traveling to other countries, and also preparing criminal cases that are ready in the box for when person A or person B steps into a country is difficult. It's challenging, so we're really hoping that this acts as a deterrent, that the Bangladeshi authorities, that the Awami League, that Hasina don't want this kind of embarrassment. They don't want other people to be sanctioned if this kind of behavior continues, and that they see that the price of this is very high. And it remains to be seen whether that's how it will be calculated. Up till now, the sanctions, I think, have clearly saved lives. There are people who have not been killed, it seems. If you just look at the statistics, it's been a significant change in the number of extrajudicial killings.
There's a number of things notable about the sanctions. First of all, it only dealt with law enforcement officials. It didn't go to political level. The people at the political level who presumably authorize some of these killings will turn a blind eye to them. Secondly, only the United States imposed sanctions, not the EU, not the UK, not Canada, not other countries. How would you respond to both those issues?
Well, I know that Human Rights Watch and other organizations are going to be asking for more people to put on the sanctions list because the evidence is clear. And for the UK, EU, and others, Australia included, to initiate their own sanctions. And I expect that will happen. Sometimes when there's a crisis, such as in Russia, or after the coup in Burma last year, you get more concerted action. It's easier. Admittedly, Bangladesh is not the top list of countries that the international community is looking at on human rights right now. And it's been a really tough few years. Russia is obviously, Russia, Ukraine is the biggest concern that people have, but there's a horrible war in Ethiopia. There's a million Rohingya still in Bangladesh because of the genocide and atrocities in Myanmar. You can go down the list. So it takes time for the wheels to turn in a lot of places. And so we didn't see concerted action, but I have very little doubt that we will see action because whatever goodwill there was towards Hasina when she came into power, and there was a lot, has long since dissipated. There are countries that deal with Hasina because they have to. And I used to have to argue with a lot of diplomats at ambassador level and senior foreign ministry officials in other countries about the facts in Bangladesh, because Human Rights Watch, we were all about the facts, right? Facts would drive our statements and conclusions. And they would argue with us because for political reasons, they didn't want to know. They didn't want to have to do something. They didn't want to have to recognize it. So for a long time, it was lower level officials that are responsible. Now they're very aware. There's nobody we talk to that doesn't know that Hasina is overseeing this consciously, that it's not happening behind her back, that she knows about it and she hasn't taken responsibility. We often have this principle in the law that you are responsible if you know or should have known that some violation was occurring. There's no question that Hasina should have known that these various security forces are carrying out killings, disappearances, arbitrary arrests, abductions, etc. And she's not taking proper steps.
Of course, the government response has been to deny that these allegations are valid at all. So I just want your response to that. But also, there also seems to be a view that they can quite quickly, through a bit of lobbying, a bit of advocacy in the States, remove the sanctions. I wondered what your view on how easy it will be for Bangladesh to actually get the government to remove those sanctions.
Well, your first question, that when they deny this, it's just laughable. It's just not serious. And I'll just point them to when they were in the opposition, how loudly they complained about the very same institutions that now are carrying out these violations, in some cases atrocities. And so they're not fooling anybody. I mean, I don't think there are very many people in the country who don't know exactly what's going on. We don't run into people in Bangladesh who say this isn't happening. They either complain about it or they justify it. And the people who justify it tend to be affiliated with the Awami League, because that's unfortunately how politics are in Bangladesh. They're very binary. You're with us or you're against us. It's a very unhealthy political scene. If the Bangladesh government wants to spend what are reported to be very large sums, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we may not know the full extent of it, in Washington to get the sanctions removed, they're just wasting taxpayer money. They have no chance. That's why I'm saying, I should just be really clear. They have no chance of lobbying their way out of this problem. They have one way out of this problem, which is to stop what they're doing. They should remove Benazir. They should remove the other leaders who have been implicated. They should put in people who are committed to following the rule of law. And then they can imagine that the sanctions, after a certain amount of time, where we see that this conduct ends, they can imagine having the sanctions lifted. Hiring lobbyists is just throwing money down the toilet.
Just moving the subject slightly, freedom of speech is another area where people talk about there being quite a significant decline. Yeah. And what is your view about freedom of speech, the role of initially it was the ICT Act and then the Digital Security Act? What role that has been about on the media freedom and also generally freedom of expression in the country?
Yeah. I mean, the ICT Act was bad, but it was nothing compared to the DSA. The DSA is intended to chill speech. It has ostensibly laudable purposes. The words they use to say, why they're doing it. Okay, you could accept that there are some social problems that require some limits on freedom of expression, particularly when it comes to hate speech. But that's not why it was passed, and that's not how it's being used. And there's no formal way to have an index on this, but in the BNP period, freedom of speech almost evaporated. And we were spending much of our time defending journalists and civil society. And Hasina and the Awami League promised it would be different. And early on in their term, in 2009 afterwards, it was different. It was better than the BNP period. And I can't put a date on it. I think journalists and some human rights and legal organizations would be really clear. Might have been 2011, 12, 13, the trend reversed. And it's just gotten worse and worse. And if, freedom of speech, if 10 out of 10 was, complete freedom of speech and 1 was no freedom of speech, it probably moved from 5 or 6 at the height of the Awami League, because there was always some residual fear that something could happen to you. You could be arrested arbitrarily, or there could be violence. There was never this complete atmosphere like, we can say what we want, short of hate speech, short of inciting violence, and people will accept it, and it'll be part of a political debate, and we can carry on. I mean, maybe if I'm generous, I'd give them a 7 at one point. But I'd say it's back to 2 or 3 now. And so much self-censorship. So many people are afraid to speak openly. I mean, just in my own dialogue with people in the country, everybody wants to be on WhatsApp or Signal. Nobody even trusts email because they know that the security services are willing to illegally listen into their conversations or read their email. People are afraid to publish their views, even when their views are peaceful. They're just political in nature. And many significant media houses, whether it's print, digital, or broadcasting, have completely changed their editorial policies so that they try to avoid having conflict with the government. And I know many, I've spoken to many journalists about how afraid they are to just do journalism. Like, journalism should not be a crime, but in Bangladesh it often is now. And that's tragic. And that is not what a party that says it's committed to liberal democracy should be doing. I mean, the Awami League should go back and start, and look at itself in the mirror and ask themselves, is this where we wanted to be? Is this what our vision was? Hasina should ask herself, is this what I dreamed of, even for myself as the leader of a government, that should be happening in society? And I think if she was honest with herself, she would say, no, this is not where I started. And then the question is, do I need to do this? And the answer still should be no. But I don't see any sign of self-consciousness or self-reflection among senior officials, including Hasina, unfortunately.
Elections are coming up. What is your view about how likely they are going to be free and fair this time around?
I think there's very low expectations in society. So I'll just reflect what people are saying to us, which is that they have very low expectations. And that's really sad, because as corrupt as the main parties were, and as much as they were enemies, power shifted election by election in Bangladesh. It was quite a remarkable trajectory, after the military dictatorship of the 1980s, to see a country come out of it and see that there was a neutral caretaker that ran the elections, that the losers accepted grudgingly. They always claimed there were violations and that they would have won if it had been really fair. But they left power. They handed power over, really up until the military stepped in, with the caretaker government. Now, of course, many people at the time thought the BNP wasn't going to hand over power if they lost that election, so we'll never know. But that was actually a really encouraging trend, and that doesn't seem to be the political settlement anymore, at least in the Awami League's eyes. It doesn't seem that they would have any intention of handing over power if they lost in a free and fair election. Of course, to know whether they lost in a free and fair election, there has to be a free and fair election, and it's not clear that the system is set up for that right now. And of course, I've worked in many countries where the opposition flailed while they were out of power, where they boycotted elections, or where they claimed foul when there wasn't foul. And so a lot of people blame the BNP for putting themselves in this situation. And I'm not a political commentator. I'm not going to comment on that. But whether or not that's true should have no bearing on whether this next election is set up in a way that all parties, not just the two main parties, can compete equally. And to do that, you need an independent electoral commission. You need a dispute resolution mechanism after the election that is independent and fair. You need a fair and equal access to the media, which we don't see, and including the state media. So all main parties should have equal access to it. It shouldn't just be a propaganda machine for the ruling party. You need to be able to register candidates. You need to be able to register political parties without interference. There's a whole checklist. It's very obvious. Anybody who's participated in democratic exercises knows what the checklist is. And if any of those things don't work, or are not available, or are tainted, then the whole thing doesn't work. Like, you could have everything right except not have free and equal access to the media. And then, of course, the party that has that controls the media is more likely to do well than the party that doesn't. And then there will always be questions. So, in the UK where you are, the US where I am, if everything worked in the electoral machinery, but there was some kind of state control of the media, we would all claim that's not a free and fair election. Or, as we're starting to see in some states in the United States, you start seeing political gerrymandering, or you have partisans running the electoral machinery. We're starting to see that in some particularly Republican states in the United States. There's going to be questions over the next election in the US, which is tragic. So everything has to work for elections to be credible, free and fair, and for ultimately it to be expressing the will of the people. And I think there's huge pessimism about that possibility in Bangladesh.
It's difficult to see right now how the main opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, will come to power. But imagine that they were somehow to find a way to power. How much confidence would you have that they will turn things around in terms of human rights? Or would you expect there's just going to be a repeat of the same thing just as when the Awami League came to power?
I have no hope that it's going to be substantially different. There might be a honeymoon period where they're trying to show that they're not the same old BNP, but they need to clean house. We still have the same leadership. We have Tariq, who, if they got into power, would operate from behind the scenes, undoubtedly. Maybe even find a way back into Bangladesh. I don't know. But he's hinted at some repentance for his role in the past, but I don't think there's any reason to think that that's sincere. The problem is we have these two families that are running a country. It's really extraordinary. After all these years, there they are. They're still there, and they don't seem to have any particular interest in putting the country ahead of their own familial and party interests. And so the people who have committed these, who presided over the BNP's terrible human rights record, are still central characters, as far as we can tell. So, if the BNP or the Awami League, for that matter, ever go through a significant leadership transition, and we see different people in authority in those parties, we could have much more hope. But I don't know about you, but I don't talk to Bangladeshis who think, well, if the BNP comes into power, it'll be substantially different. They might support the BNP for their own reasons. Other people might support the Awami League for other reasons. But I don't see anyone saying there's a major human rights difference anymore. And I'll tell you, you started this conversation by asking me about what my hopes were, or was I optimistic when the Awami League came into power? I did think that they would be substantially better than the BNP, simply because the BNP had taken the country in such a negative direction that was worse than when the Awami League had previously been in power. So I was hoping the Awami League, as poor as their record was in their previous term in power on human rights, that it might be about the same as that. But they have continued the degradation of human rights in the country in their time in power. And this just, in my mind, means the aphorism that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is sometimes correct. And I think power has gone to the head of the leadership of the Awami League. They think it's their country. It's not the country of the people of Bangladesh or the voters. It's their country to control and do with as they want. And therefore, they continue to commit serious abuses. And I just don't think that there's much evidence that the BNP would be different if they came to power.
Would you respond to that argument that social, economic, and cultural rights have improved significantly in Bangladesh whilst the Awami League has been in power? And okay, there may have been some poor human rights. There have been some human rights violations, but it's a price that is worth paying.
Well, the Asian values argument that was made in the 1990s by China, Singapore, Malaysia has been thoroughly discredited and largely dropped even by them. We would kind of have the Chinese Communist Party, the Vietnamese Communist Party making those arguments now. Very few others do, because there's no obvious connection between the two. There's no reason why you have to give up one right to get another right. So if the Hasina or the Bangladesh government ever tried to make that argument explicitly, I would just say, I guess I would say to her in conversation, I didn't realize that you had moved to Beijing. because you're basically making the argument that Xi Jinping makes, that nobody outside China really accepts. And it would be kind of sad for her to make an argument like that when she claims to be a Democrat, small d Democrat. It's great that Bangladesh has made progress economically. I will say it's in a good neighborhood. Asia mainland Asia is a good place to be making economic progress. But whatever credit the Bangladesh government has earned for that, I give them full marks. I don't think they get as much credit as they claim. I think the data doesn't show it's quite as great a positive story as they say, but there's been a lot of credit, a lot of good things that happened. But that doesn't give any justification for all the violence and human rights abuses and corruption. By the way, every dollar that's taken from somebody in a bribe is a dollar that's not put to productive use. That's taken out of someone's pocket so they could care for their family. So if you're in favor of economic development, you should be 100% against corruption, because every dollar that's lost to those people is a dollar in economic development that's been neutralized. And so I don't see a huge commitment to anti-corruption in Bangladesh either. So it's a mixed picture on that side. Good on them for what they've done well. Don't take credit for things that you didn't do. Crack down on corruption. Get the standards in factories and other places up. Focus on rural poverty, which is the real issue in the country. Focus on education for girls and women, because that's the engine of economic prosperity in the long run. I think the government is committed to it rhetorically and has done decently, but not as well as they could. And early and forced marriage for girls, because that's a disaster for those people individually and a disaster for the country socially and economically. And this violence, because you do not need to carry out violence through extrajudicial killings, disappearances, abductions to have economic growth. I mean, look at the most prosperous countries in the world; they don't have both those things. There's no necessary connection between. You can't argue that we need the violence in order to have economic growth. That's nonsense.
And just one final question. I think I need to just ask something about the Rohingya crisis, because that's a crisis where Bangladesh you may want to applaud them in some parts and criticize them in others. So how do you view the whole Rohingya crisis, the way Bangladesh has managed to host so many hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas, and how the hosting has developed as years went on?
Well, first, it's a huge undertaking, and has been since the 1990s when the first 250,000 or so Rohingya came. And the economic and social and political burden is enormous. And the international community has not stepped up and done all it should have. There's no doubt about it. We've been very loud about that. We've complained vociferously to donors. I also think there's a large element of Islamophobia here internationally. We see very few Rohingya resettled, whereas we saw Christian Chins from Burma resettled in large numbers. And we've seen other communities resettled to third countries, the United States, Europe, and other places. So it's a very difficult environment for Bangladesh to be a neighbor to a genocidal military regime, and it's a continuing burden. At the same time, let's not forget that the successive Bangladeshi governments have been terrible to the Rohingya over the years. They're very happy for them to live as miserable a life as possible on the grounds that they thought that making them unhappy and miserable would mean that they would just walk back into Burma and assume the risks of living under the Tatmadaw. And that hasn't happened. Didn't happen in the 90s very much, and has hardly happened since the 2012 and 2017 violence. I went to Bangladesh right after the 2012 violence and pleaded with the government to be generous to the Rohingya, that these were human beings. If you want to look at them as fellow Muslims, please do. If you want to look at them as having some kind of historical relationship, culturally, ethnically, and otherwise, feel free. But the Bangladeshi government pushed them back. You may remember in 2012, after the June and then October violence against the Rohingya. I think you covered it. We certainly did. Lots of media covered it. There's just horrifying videos of boats being pushed back out to sea, and a number of those boats sank. So, I mean, as a legal matter, the government of Bangladesh has legal responsibility for those deaths. Of course, so does the Tatmadaw. And it was only in 2017 when the violence started, the Bangladeshi government didn't react well right away. It was only after public opinion was extremely upset and angry about this that the government reversed course. And we're very grateful they did. Whatever their motives were, whatever their initial inclinations were, it's very important that they essentially allowed the border to be open. And ultimately, around 750,000 people came across. And at the beginning, I think the government was pretty generous. Once they changed their mind and decided not to try to push people back. And possibly they didn't push people back because they just couldn't. The numbers were too large. But whatever their motives, they were pretty generous. They allowed international organizations to operate fairly freely, never completely freely. But we've seen in recent years a narrowing of the access for international organizations, surrounding the camps with barbed wire, which has been a disaster when there have been fires, and people have died because of that, of course. The opening of Basan Char, which still makes no sense to me. I mean, the most they're going to be able to move a fraction of that 750,000, or maybe, even you can consider it 1 million with the old refugees. So why go to the trouble of moving people to an island in the middle of the ocean that could be swamped during a cyclone, or cuts people off from their family and friends, and that's opposed by most Rohingya? This has been a big mystery. Like, what's the reason for doing this? But Hasina is very committed to it. And so, and then the Bangladeshi government is, I think, still has this ridiculous expectation that someday some deal will be done with Myanmar and people will go back voluntarily. And that's just not going to happen. It didn't happen for that group in the 1990s almost at all. It's certainly not going to, when the violence was much worse in 2017, it's not going to happen. And people can just look at what's happening to Rohingya that remain in Myanmar. Those in Central Rakhine State are still in essentially detention camps, haven't been able to go back to their villages. And it's a police state in areas around Mongda and other parts of northern Rakhine State. So this is a reality. It's a geographic reality. The United States is next to Mexico and Central America and Latin America, and there's probably 11 million undocumented people in the United States. That's what the estimates are. It's true. I used to live in Cambodia. There's probably hundreds of thousands of ethnic Vietnamese citizens in Cambodia. And Thailand has Burmese. This is the world we live in, and the Bangladesh government should stop denying the reality of geography and politics and history, and just be as generous as possible. Allow international organizations in to do their work, to provide humanitarian aid. Let children go to school. I mean, it's so heartless. It's just unimaginable. The Bangladesh government policy is for kids not to get an education, not to learn in Bangla, where they're going to live. Saying that they can only learn in their, in their original language, but they can only, there's no, they banned informal schools. Like, why would you do that? Why would you create large numbers of illiterate people? How does that benefit anybody? It doesn't benefit them. It doesn't benefit Bangladesh. These people are going to live in Bangladesh for most likely until the Tatmadaw falls. And they've been in power since 1962, pretty much, with a minor exception, with sort of a coalition with Aung San Suu Kyi and the LD, where they still really held most of the power. So, I want the Tatmadaw to go away. Everybody who works in human rights wants the Tatmadaw to fall and disappear, but we don't see that happening anytime soon.